April 1945, a quiet residential street near Erfurt, Germany. The air is cold and smells of wet brick and spent gunpowder. 3 American soldiers move toward a darkened stone house. They carry heavy gear and rifles held tight to their chests. In the shadows of a nearby doorway, their platoon leader watches with a silver flashlight gripped in his gloved hand. He clicks the switch. A beam of harsh white light cuts through the mist. It splashes against the backs of the 3 men as they step into the entrance. They are no longer soldiers in the dark. They are perfect black cutouts against a glowing white circle. A rifle cracks from the second floor of the house. Then another. The 3 men fall in the doorway, pinned there by the very light meant to guide them. General Patton would soon arrive to show a young officer that some tools are more dangerous than bullets when a man's rank exceeds his judgment. This is the story of how a single flashlight transformed 3 American soldiers into targets, and the brutal lesson General Patton delivered to the officer responsible. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. By following our channel, you ensure that these moments of hard-won battlefield justice are never forgotten by history. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto was 28 years old and came from the lush, green valleys of Honolulu, Hawaii. He served with the 100th Infantry Battalion before being folded into the larger push across Germany. Yamamoto had spent 14 months in the meat grinder of the European theater. He had seen the mud of Italy and the frozen forests of the Ardennes. He carried the weight of a family held in an internment camp back in the States, a fact that drove him to prove his loyalty with every step he took on foreign soil. By the time his squads reached the outskirts of Erfurt, Yamamoto was a master of the urban hunt. He had cleared 50 buildings. He knew how to move like a ghost in the shadows. He knew that in a dark hallway, your ears are more important than your eyes. He survived because he respected the darkness and the lethal secrets it held. Second Lieutenant Paul Winters was 23 years old and hailed from a wealthy neighborhood in Albany, New York. He was a fresh arrival to the Third Army, with barely 2 months of time in the theater and 0 hours of actual combat clearing. Winters was a man who believed that regulations and equipment were the ultimate masters of the battlefield. He arrived at the front with a tailored wool coat and a heavy 3-cell chrome flashlight he had purchased at a high-end sporting goods store back home. It was far more powerful than the standard military issue. Winters often remarked to his fellow officers that a commander's job was to illuminate the chaos of war. He believed that light was synonymous with control. To him, the tactical doctrines regarding light discipline were merely suggestions for those who lacked the courage to see the enemy face to face. He viewed the seasoned caution of his NCOs as a sign of hesitation rather than expertise. He was an officer who believed his rank granted him a clarity of vision that years of survival could not provide. He was determined to lead with the light, unaware that he was holding a beacon for his own executioner. By April 1945, the Third Army was racing across central Germany at a pace that left the logistics maps in tatters. The German Wehrmacht was no longer a cohesive fighting force, but it had morphed into something arguably more dangerous for the individual infantryman. The front lines had dissolved into 1,000 jagged edges. Every small town and nameless village near Erfurt had become a potential fortress. German soldiers, often separated from their units, were fighting from cellars, attics, and barn lofts. They were desperate, hungry, and waiting in the dark. For the Americans, this meant the war had shifted from the grand maneuvers of tanks across open fields to the claustrophobic, room-by-room terror of urban clearing. In this environment, experience was the only currency that mattered. Men who had survived since Normandy knew that the night was not an obstacle to be overcome with technology, but a shroud to be utilized. Standard procedure dictated that buildings were to be cleared in near-total darkness, or by the flickering light of a handheld grenade's blast. Most officers understood that the human eye takes nearly 30 minutes to fully adapt to low light, and a single flash of a match or a torch could ruin that biological advantage instantly. They let their veteran NCOs dictate the pace and the method. They stayed quiet, stayed dark, and stayed alive. But the rapid pace of the advance meant that replacements were flooding into the lines. Young officers, fresh from stateside academies, arrived with notebooks full of theory and hearts full of a dangerous kind of certainty. They had missed the hard lessons of the hedgerows and the Vosges. To them, the darkness of a German basement was a problem to be solved with a battery and a bulb. They viewed the tactical silence of the veterans as a lack of aggression. They believed that because they represented the liberating force of the world, they should walk into the light. That arrogance was a silent killer. It waited in the doorways of a quiet town near Erfurt, where the lessons of the training manual met the reality of a hidden rifleman. Sergeant Yamamoto crouched near the garden wall of the third house and held up a hand. The platoon stopped. The air was deathly still, and the only sound was the distant rumble of artillery. Yamamoto moved back to Lieutenant Winters and kept his voice to a low, gravelly whisper. He told the officer that the building was too quiet. He explained that his men had their eyes adjusted to the moonlight, and that they would go in slow, using touch and shadow to find the Germans. Winters looked at the dark doorway, and then at the polished silver body of his heavy flashlight. He told the sergeant that he couldn't see a thing. He said it was impossible to clear a room if you didn't know what was in the corners. Yamamoto shook his head and warned the lieutenant that the light worked both ways. He told him that if they turned on the lamps, they would be showing the enemy exactly where to aim before they even crossed the threshold. He said the light would show the Germans where they were before the Americans could see them. Winters didn't want to hear it. He snapped that he was the one in command and that he wouldn't have his men stumbling around in the dark like blind tenants. He told Yamamoto that visibility was a requirement for a successful sweep. The sergeant tried one more time, his voice urgent and tight. He reminded the lieutenant that they had trained for weeks on light discipline and night adaptation. He told him the training existed because flashlights caused casualties. Winters cut him off and said that the training was for the woods, not for a solid German house. He claimed that the flashlight would daze the enemy and give the squad the advantage. He looked at the three men at the front of the line and gave the order. He told them to turn on their lights the moment they hit the door. The men looked at Yamamoto, then back at the lieutenant. They were torn between the survival instincts their sergeant had beaten into them and the direct orders of a commissioned officer. Winters grew impatient and told them to move out. He said he wanted those rooms lit up like a storefront. He followed closely behind them, clicking his own 3-cell light onto the high beam. The powerful column of white light punched through the dark and hit the soldiers in the back, casting long, sharp shadows deep into the house. As the first man stepped into the frame of the door, his silhouette was perfect. He was a black shape against a brilliant white target. The German rifleman in the shadows of the stairs didn't have to guess. He didn't have to search for a target. He simply fired into the center of the light. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. 3 Americans slumped into the doorway, lit from behind by the very beams Winters had insisted upon. The lieutenant stood frozen as the light from his own hand washed over the bodies of his men. Yamamoto pulled the survivors back into the alley and immediately sent a runner to the command post. The report of the tactical failure and the specific cause of the deaths reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. The low growl of his modified jeep cut through the heavy silence of the street. He didn't wait for his driver to open the door. He stepped out onto the cobblestones, his 4 stars catching the dim morning light and his ivory-handled revolvers resting prominently on his hips. The men of the platoon stood at immediate, rigid attention, their eyes fixed forward. Patton did not look at the bodies being loaded into an ambulance. He did not look at the smoke still rising from the chimney. He walked straight toward Lieutenant Winters, his boots clicking with a cold, rhythmic precision. The general stopped inches from the young officer's face. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His presence was a physical weight that pressed the air out of the room. He looked at the 3-cell chrome flashlight still gripped in the lieutenant's hand. Patton asked Winters if he had ordered the use of lights during the entry. Winters swallowed hard and whispered that he had. Patton asked him if he was aware of the standard tactical doctrine regarding light discipline. Winters said he was, but he felt visibility was essential for safety. Patton then asked the lieutenant how many buildings he had cleared before this morning. The lieutenant admitted this was his first. Patton looked over at Sergeant Yamamoto and asked him how many buildings he had cleared in his 14 months of combat. Yamamoto replied that he had cleared 50. Finally, Patton turned back to Winters and asked if the sergeant had advised against the use of flashlights. Winters stared at the general's stars and confessed that the sergeant had warned him. Patton stood in silence for a long moment, let the weight of that confession hang in the air. Then he spoke. He told Winters that he had been given a gift that most officers would kill for, which was a veteran NCO who knew how to stay alive. He said that instead of using that knowledge, the lieutenant had used his rank to overrule common sense. Patton pointed at the doorway and said that visibility is a double-edged sword. He explained that when a man turns on a light in a dark room, he isn't just seeing the enemy. He is offering himself as a target. He told the lieutenant that those 3 men didn't die because of German marksmanship, but because their own officer had turned them into neon signs in a shooting gallery. He said that a leader's first duty is to his men's lives, not his own comfort or his own ego. Patton looked at the chrome flashlight and said it was a fine tool for a night watchman in Albany, but in a combat zone, it was a death sentence. He then gave Winters a choice. He could face a court-martial for gross negligence and spend the rest of the war in a cell. Or he could surrender his tactical authority. He told Winters that he was being removed from leadership effective immediately. He would remain with the unit, but he would not give another order. Instead, he would spend every hour of every day as a private soldier, undergoing building, clearing, retraining under the command of Sergeant Yamamoto. He told Winters to listen to the man who knew how to survive, or he would be sent home in a box with his flashlight tucked under his arm. Winters stood silent, his face pale, and slowly handed the light to the general. The punishment began at dawn in the center of the town square, under the watchful eyes of the entire battalion. Lieutenant Winters stood at the threshold of a bombed-out tailor shop, but he was no longer a leader of men. He wore the plain olive drab of a private, his bars stripped and his ego shattered. Following Patton's orders, Sergeant Yamamoto stood 10 paces behind him, holding the heavy chrome flashlight. The morning was gray and thick with fog, smelling of wet limestone and the metallic tang of nearby tanks. As Winters prepared to enter the darkened building, Yamamoto clicked the switch. The powerful beam hit the small of the former officer's back, casting a violent, high-contrast silhouette into the pitch-black interior. Winters froze. He could see his own shadow stretched thin across the debris, a perfect, unmissable outline for any hidden rifleman. He felt the cold air on his neck and the terrifying weight of the light pressing against his spine. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a hammer being cocked. He realized, with a sickening jolt in his stomach, that he was utterly visible while the world ahead of him remained a mystery. The soldiers watching from the street remained silent, their faces hard and unreadable as they watched their former commander experience the lethal vulnerability he had forced upon his men. He moved into the dark, a glowing target in a world of shadows. Takeshi Yamamoto returned to Honolulu after the war ended in 1945. He never spoke of the night near Erfurt to the local newspapers or even to his own children. He worked for 30 years as a foreman in a sugar mill, a man known for his quiet efficiency and his habit of walking through the dark factory floors without ever needing a torch. He lived a full, disciplined life and passed away in 2002, at the age of 85. To his family, he was a peaceful gardener. To the men of the 100th Infantry, he was the sergeant who saved those who were willing to listen. Paul Winters remained in Europe until 1946, serving out his time in administrative roles far from the front lines. He never regained a tactical command. After his discharge, he returned to Albany and joined his family's real estate firm. Those who knew him noted that he became a man obsessed with safety and lighting, often funding street lamp projects across the city. He died in 1991, leaving behind a massive collection of antique lanterns and lighting equipment. He never once mentioned his service under Patton or the name of the sergeant who had forced him to walk into the shadows of a tailor shop. General Patton recorded the incident in a brief, dry entry in his personal diary, noting that a young officer had finally learned that the sun does not rise on command. He kept the chrome flashlight in a box of captured German souvenirs for several months before eventually gifting it to a Signal Corps private. Years later, a staff officer recalled Patton remarking that the most dangerous weapon in the hands of a fool is not a gun, but a light that reveals everything except the enemy. He believed that the lesson in that German town squares had saved more lives than any speech he could have given at a podium. Some historians argue that General Patton's methods in this instance were unnecessarily theatrical and potentially humiliating to a commissioned officer in front of his subordinates. They suggest that a private reprimand or a standard military tribunal would have sufficed to address the tactical error without damaging the chain of command's dignity. Others argue that the extremity of the punishment was the only way to ensure the lesson was truly learned in a high-stakes combat environment. They maintain that Patton's mirrored justice saved countless lives by instantly correcting a fatal trend of arrogance among new arrivals. What is certain is that after the incident near Erfurt, light discipline across the Third Army improved significantly as word of the lieutenant's retraining spread through the ranks. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply issued a formal reprimand? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe. Small choices in the dark define the fate of nations.